to the promise I have. Nothing compares to the promise I have in you.
Amen. Please be seated. Will you pray with me? Let us fill our hearts with the love of Jesus Christ and give thanks for the love that is shown to us through the words and actions of him. May these words I speak tonight be acceptable to you, Lord, in the knowledge that I offer them to you as an expression of my love. Amen.
Amen.
Wow, what a week it's been. It's been a week of surprises, scary moments and mixed confusion. And I thought I'd start the sermon eventually. I'll explain later. As you know, my history with MCC goes back a long, long way. It goes as far as meeting two guys in Chicago in 1982 while on a journey across the States. I met them on a Saturday and we had quite a pleasant day. We were looking at glass, and because I had stained glass windows I was trying to sell to them, and we got talking about church. And church to them was the Metropolitan Community Church. I'd never heard of that before. 1982 this was. And I said, I'm quite interested. So they said, okay Robert, would you like to come with us? We're going on Sunday, 11 o'clock service on the outskirts of Chicago. So I met up and we went to a small room. And from memory, I think there was about 13 or 14 of us there. Totally new to me, having a service in a room, somebody's house. However, this introduction made me look for an MCC in England, and eventually took me to a service in Sistover Street in Balham, run by the Reverend Gene White. This was South London. It was quite difficult for me to get to, however, I was living in North London. And this service was held in an upstairs room over the top of a shop. I remember it was freezing cold and they had oil stoves to heat up the room. Can't remember, it must have been the winter. Anyway, we got through that and got through the service, and Jean is lovely. She was lovely. She got friendly with everybody. It felt like one big happy family. Anyway, I went there on different occasions, but subsequently I met up with the Reverend Hong Tang, who was trying to build a church in Camden. This was much nearer to me. And he had a little service in his home, in an upstairs room. This was a trend that was originally set up, as we all already know, by Troy Perry. Because Troy Perry, our founder, started up in October the 6th, 1968, with 11 others who met in an upstairs room in his own living room in Los Angeles. And subsequent churches started life in this way. This also is the way we started. For those of you who were there at that first meeting, we met at Mary's on that day, and I managed to find some photographs which I sent to Michael. However, let's go back to Troy. Troy's church grew rapidly, and the community bought their own place of worship. But that building, like many others that followed, was destroyed by fire in 1973. The growth of MCC continued throughout the States, with small congregations meeting in rooms and small halls. And even today, apparently, most MCC churches in the States average between 30 and 70 members. Now, here in London, in the UK, Gene White was running a small prayer group for lesbian and gay Christians, which was called the Fellowship of Christ the Liberator, meeting in her flat when she met up with Troy Perry. and her group voted to join the Metropolitan Community Church. That was the very beginning of the MCC here in the UK. Jean's flat meetings moved to a room over a shop in Balham. This is the one in Sisterford Street. My first visit was in 1983, 10 years after its first inauguration. By 1979, Jean White had been elected an elder at the Los Angeles General Conference and was the first person outside of America to do so. With small ads trying to get known, just as we struggle to get known here in Brighton, small ads in Gay News, which was the newspaper at the time, in 1986, many small Christian groups who were wanting to join MCC across the UK found that there was a church they could actually get started. Jean ended up needing more help as these groups started to grow. And in 1987, Reverend Hong Tang, Carol Wooden, who came from Denmark, where she was starting a couple of churches, were called to help set up a structure to oversee this expansion of MCC, not just in the UK, but also in Europe. I was co-opted onto the board in 1991 to assist the workload of setting up small groups in the UK. As I love driving, this wasn't a problem, and many weekends meeting small gatherings throughout the UK. And of course, those gatherings were in little rooms. Rooms in flats. There weren't any other churches then. Brighton was no exception. And while on the board of what was now known as the European North Sea District Committee, I met up with the Reverend David Miller. He led a very small congregation meeting in a small hall down here in Brighton, just off the Lewis Road. Unfortunately, it's now been pulled down as a block of flats. I remember going the first time to that church at the request of Reverend Hong Tang, sitting on the board, because we weren't really happy the way things were going. However, I came down and there was only about 4 or 5 members there, and I thought, okay, that's fine. That's how churches start. You start with 3, 4, 5 people and it grows. I came down a couple of weeks later from London, went to the service, and there were 3 people there. I thought, this is really, really strange. When I reported back to the Reverend Hong Tang and Jean White, they said, well, what's it like down there, Robert? I said, well, it's not going very well. It's struggling. Anyway, this went on a few times, it kept on coming down. Congregations were very, very small. And it was in a hall which was about half the size of this. So it's fairly big. You can imagine the small numbers in there, it was cold, etc. Anyway, following on from that, the North London MCC continued to be my place of worship, and it was overseen by the Reverend Hong Tang and later Jill and Doreen, for those who used to go to North London. Continuing in Brighton, Brightways was eventually set up in Brighton in 2004, and I gave the new church as much assistance as needed to run the new MCC. The Reverend David Miller had stepped down and there was no more church in the Lewis Road. Brightways managed to rent the hall next door, St Mary's Church Hall, for their services, and they were there for several years. Unfortunately, due to many reasons, I parted from Brightways and travelled up to North London frequently until it became almost impossible. In the meantime, several ex-members of Brightways were contacting me asking if there was a place to worship. I was only a church member. Half a dozen or so met at my house, regularly each Sunday at 11 o'clock. We sang hymns and we actually served communion. And eventually, Bernard Young, who was on the group then, we had between 6 and 8 people meeting each Sunday, and he suggested that we use his garage. So we converted the garage into a small church every Sunday, and Bernard, being quite artistic, went overboard and we had black drapes everywhere and everything. And it was like a little chapel inside this garage. I often thought afterwards what the neighbours used to think, because we would cheerfully sing the hymns from a hymn book that I put together, because while I was in North London we had compiled our own book, just as we now have our own book here. And so we had wide selection and we had tape music to go along with that. Nigel and Jerry joined us after 2 years, together with a lot of other women members who were ex-members of Bright Waves. And these services went on for over 5 years. Those 5 years, people were coming to us and asking if they could join us. And we never had more than about, well, I think we had about a dozen at one time. But we called ourselves a little faith group. It kept us going in our belief, because we were friends, and just as you are all friends here in this church tonight, you got to feel cosy, worshipping together. And that's why we met in different people's houses. We met in Elaine's home, my home, Bernard's garage, and wherever it was convenient at the time. Now, I was looking up some bits and pieces to actually tie up with the early beginnings of this church. And it was while I was writing this and seeking some photos of our first meeting that the first scary thing happened on Tuesday last. I had found a picture that included Bernard Young at the village's first service, and I remembered, or reminded myself, that I must ring him, as I'd lost touch for 6 months. At that very moment, my phone rang. It was Bernard Young, asking me how I was. And I still feel the hairs going up on the back of my neck. Scary. Now, those who do not know, Bright Waves came to an end and MCC started meeting at the URC in Shoreham. We also went to the Sussex Royal. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but there is a little chapel. As you go into the hospital, if you go straight up the stairs between the lifts and you turn left, there's a lovely little Victorian chapel there, which is oak panels. It's quite heavy, being Victorian, and I remember when Bernard and I were up there, we decided to brighten it up, and we asked the hospital padre if we could do something. He said, yes, please do. And we built a little altar, which was stepped up from mini lights, and it lit up. We put it on power. In actual fact, about 5 years ago, I just popped in there while I was there, and it was still there. And it brightened up that little chapel. And I also remember when Bernard and I used to sing Taizé songs, and the songs used to echo throughout. And one of the nurses came in one day and she said, "We love it. Please leave the chapel door open when you're here, because we can hear it throughout some of the walls upstairs," which made us feel really, really good. A need for MCC in central Brighton was now becoming essential, which coincidentally came at a time when the Reverend Michael Hydes and Chris were returning from the USA. Our first meeting was at Mary's home, and she would very kindly continue to offer her home for worship until 5 years ago, when this church, the village, was formed. As so many startups for MCC churches, and remembering our little faith groups, I decided my Bible reading was to be, well, a reading that actually brought us all together. Christ is with however small numbers gathered together. It's where something else happened. And I brought it to Michael tonight. I sent Michael my readings. Matthew 18, 19 to 20. He's giggling away here. He came back with the reading which you had tonight. Those who say, I love God, and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen, cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from him is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also. Now that wasn't the reading I'd chosen. The reading I had chosen, although it was appropriate, and I don't understand why it was appropriate, because Michael could have chosen anything which wouldn't have fitted into my sermon tonight. My reading was Matthew 18, 19 to 20. Again, I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three come together in my name, there am I with them. This is called faith. And that's what all of us bring together when we meet up at the village MCC. Amen.
Amen.